Hey there, it's me Amelia here, and welcome to my second commentary. And I'm going to attempt a somewhat controversial subject, the mysterious Mr. Enter. Now before you click back, yes, I know there are a lot of commentaries on this guy, or at least there used to be. And yes, I know that quite a few of his haters are really immature. However, this particular video needs to be commented on. It's actually not one of his reviews, but it's about his own work. And it's very revealing. But anyway, enough chit-chat, let's get started.
Growing Around is a project that's very dear to my heart.
Okay, so far so good. A lot of us have projects like that.
Currently, I have finished the first draft of the novel, which is about 65,000 words.
It might be nice to explain the project a bit more before you tell us the word count. Anyway, he rambles for a long time about his writing history, and I'm gonna skip that.
But what is Growing Around?
In my humble little opinion, a disaster. And yes, in case you're wondering, I have read the book in question.
It started as wanting to be a webtoon or a pilot, some kind of animated series.
I love how you don't mention that you initially thought you could actually sell it to a TV network. Why, it's almost like you didn't want to be accused of having delusions of grandeur.
But through a series of events, the team that I gathered decided that the work might be better suited to a book series as a start. Now, the voice actors are still going to do their part during an audio reading. One of our artists is still doing all the art for it, like the cover. But more specifically, the general premise of the series was that the stories took place in a world where kids were still kids and adults were still adults, but the roles were swapped. It was to be a world designed and controlled by kids.
I also love how you don't mention the fact that you stole the idea from a Disney short called Flip Flopped, which you even made an atrocity review of.
I don't think that this idea is particularly unique or anything like that.
Especially considering the fact that you stole it. Granted, Flip Flopped was a pretty bland short, but God, at least acknowledge where you got the idea from.
I'm sure that many people at least had this idea a few times growing up, but still the concept gives a lot of people pause.
That's because if you think about it for more than a few minutes, you realize that a world run by kids would quickly dissolve into chaos.
So, let's go really in-depth about it. The first thing that you have to know about the world of Growing Around is, within the work, the world works. By that I mean, it's not a dystopia or post-apocalypse. The world functions within the story.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems with that. For one thing, the kids in your world are inexplicably skilled enough to have jobs despite having never gone to school. And for another thing, once they grow up, they lose their freedom to their offspring. Yeah, let me say that again. People lose their freedom once they grow up.
Pretty much wherever this idea is told, everything is terrible and dark and dystopic in the work. I think it's Lord of the Flies that largely influences how people think of this genre, and we have everything from Children of the Corn to The Tribe that builds upon this. In fiction, worlds ruled by children are a terrible place.
First off, an idea is not a genre. Second, fiction tends to portray worlds run by kids like this because kids are generally immature. And third, a world where you lose your freedom for no good reason as soon as you grow up is a terrible place, no matter how much you try to sugarcoat it.
They're cold and tough and dark, even though fiction is about the fantastical and stuff that couldn't possibly exist in reality.
Yes, but that's not an excuse to throw out all logic.
Growing Around can be cold and dark and tough at times, but at its default, it's not. One thing that makes all the difference, and I think needs to be understood, is that this is a series that is written for children. I don't mean that in a condescending, it's so stupid, haha, they won't notice Teen Titans Go kind of way.
No, you mean that in a, I don't need to explain anything and I can throw away all logic kind of way.
I mean that this series was always designed to specifically appeal to the mind of a child. You could not tell this story in a book for adults, for instance.
Because most adults would quickly notice the gigantic holes and unfortunate implications in your world.
At least, not without making it the horrific dystopias mentioned above.
So you admit that adults will point out that your world makes no sense?
So let's ask, what makes a good story aimed at children?
Not something where people become slaves to their kids as soon as they grow up, I can tell you that.
To answer that, you're going to need to think about what issues do kids generally go through.
I've actually spent a lot of time with kids through babysitting and substitute teaching, and I really don't think that your book is something that's going to really appeal to them. For one thing, the characters are really bland and stereotypical. They feel like they were written by someone whose idea of what kids are like came from watching Nickelodeon. Like, all kids want to eat nothing but sugar. All kids love getting dirty. But I'm getting off topic. On with the video.
I don't mean the straightforward issues like school or chores or friendship. I'm talking about abstract and complex issues to how all of those things relate.
So now you're a child psychologist?
And when you get down to it, I don't think that any child goes through their childhood without feeling powerless or underestimated. And many children's works meet those specific needs.
And they do so without making adults in their stories slaves.
How many children's works have a monster where the adults can't do anything against it, either out of stupidity or thinking that it's just a childish game, or a lack of innocence, or even their own adult lives? Every book where the kids go to a magical school or get a superpower, it answers the feeling of powerlessness. In works where kids are able to outsmart villains much older than them, it answers the feelings of being underestimated. To put it basically, every work of children's literature needs to give kids a strong sense of agency. More often than not, that's what makes or breaks it.
Other things can make or break it too, such as actually telling a good story or having interesting characters, or, making sense.
Growing Around attempts to meet both of those feelings. The feeling of powerlessness is an obvious one. Growing Around meets that on its face. In the world of Growing Around, kids have the power over their families, their countries, and their communities,
while the adults have no rights. Joy.
But feeling of being underestimated is a more interesting one, and it's another one that the world of Growing Around is also supposed to meet on arrival.
I'm really starting to feel like you think too highly of your own work, especially given that if you hadn't written it, you would probably pick apart the logic left and right.
The kid civilization within the book is able to keep up and at some points surpass the real-world alternative.
Oh, so now your world is better than the real world. Wow.
This is one of the reasons that I've always been hesitant to give some kind of explanation to why this world is working the way it is.
You don't want to explain it because it's better than the real world? Am I hearing you correctly? Pardon me if I don't particularly want to live in a place where I'd lose my freedom as soon as I turned 18.
Beyond general hints within the series. And there are actually many reasons for that.
As a side note, while he was writing the book, he did at one point stick in a prologue where the world was the result of a kid's birthday wish, which actually could have been the start of a book much more interesting than this one. But anyway, I'm guessing that he decided to take the prologue out since he doesn't mention it here.
A sense of wonder and intrigue is very important to children's books and children's media. In Growing Around's peer groups, books and movies and games and television shows aimed at a similar audience, we have works like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Actually, I think that Charlie is a pretty good way to put this.
Oh boy, here we go. By the way, I love how you put in that little note bitching about your critics. Real mature.
Explaining the magic is the difference between the original movie and the remake. The more modern version is more explained, more sterile, and less magical.
Wow, I love how you just assume that everyone must think the Tim Burton version is inferior. And second, the Tim Burton version doesn't explain the magic, as you put it. Yes, it gives Willy Wonka a backstory and explains where the Oompa Loompas come from, but the magic itself is still unexplained.
By explaining everything about why Willy Wonka is the way he is, it loses some of the charm.
Again, I love how you don't even entertain the possibility that some people could prefer the Burton version. I happen to like that we get to know Willy Wonka better in the new one. It makes him more of a sympathetic character, and yes, it feels more magical. And while we're on the subject, in both versions, as well as the book, the characters still behave in a believable manner. Veruca Salt is a brat because her parents spoil her. Augustus Gloop is a glutton because he's allowed to have as much sugar as he wants. Both of them are examples of what happens when kids are never taught self-control. Granted, it's exaggerated, but it's still believable.
Explaining the magic, and keep in mind, I'm using magic in a very loose sense here. It could also refer to something like faster than light travel, whatever is the book's special thing. It's always a dicey proposition.
First, it's really pretentious to put your own work in the same category as these beloved stories. And second, one of these things is not like the others. In these other stories, the unreal elements are natural phenomena in their universes, or in the case of sci-fi elements, they're the result of advanced science. In your work, however, the unreal elements are the direct result of the adults behaving illogically, giving up their authority to their kids for no good reason.
Let me put it as simply as possible. I never wanted kids to rule the world of Growing Around because of midichlorians.
And now you're basing your argument on a misconception. The Star Wars geek's gonna say this once, so you'd better listen. Midichlorians are not the Force. Here's what Qui-Gon says. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. In other words, they just explain why some people are Force sensitive and others aren't, and why some people might be more in tune with the Force than others. They do not explain the Force itself.
In the Star Wars prequels, we know so much about the world and how it works.
And that makes the Star Wars universe really interesting. Seeing all these new planets and how the old Republic worked and how the old Jedi Order worked and how the Empire rose, it creates an even bigger universe and a new sense of wonder.
All while saying screw the characters and screw the plot. And avoiding something like that is of highest priority.
And yet again, you just assume that everybody must be anti-prequel because you are. And while we're on the subject, one of the reasons why I love Star Wars so much, along with other things like Harry Potter and Avatar: The Last Airbender, is because their universes are so vast and detailed. They're so intricately thought out that you can imagine them really existing.
To go for a more traditional explanation, think of the world like a magician on a stage. We know that he can't really pull a rabbit out of his hat, but we don't care because that's what the illusion is.
Says he who nitpicks cartoon jokes to high heaven. And if you didn't write it, you'd probably ask some of the same questions I ask. Like, for example, how does anyone in this universe learn to read or write when the kids don't go to school? Is everyone just born as a super baby or something? And why do the adults need to go to school when they should already know the stuff they're being taught? Do they get amnesia when they turn 18? There's a difference between maintaining a sense of wonder and just plain not giving a crap about whether or not a world makes sense.
You know, unless you're one of those people who do care and try to ruin the trick for everyone explaining how it's done, and make it boring and sterile.
Translation. Unless you're one of those people who critiques my universe and dares to actually ask questions about it.
Even works that have been risen into mass consciousness have plot-destroying plot holes that render their world unbelievable and illogical. Harry Potter, for instance.
And now you're putting your work in the same category as one of the most beloved stories from our modern age.
Tell me, within the first book, no word of God, no sequels.
If you're going to ignore the later books, then your argument already fails even before it starts.
Within the first book, why would any Muggle parent take their child out of school to stop learning math, science, and English to learn magic, something they probably only found out existed that day?
Well, within the world of the first book, Aunt Petunia says that when Lily got her letter, her parents said, "We have a witch in the family. Isn't that wonderful?"
In a school where kids have a very real chance of dying. Was every situation like the Dursleys where they got kidnapped all year? If that was the case, I don't see the magical world staying hidden from Muggles for very long.
Kidnapped? What do you mean kidnapped? The Dursleys explain Harry's absence by saying he's going to a school for incurably criminal boys. And as for the magical world being exposed, have you ever heard of the Obliviate spell? Yes, that was introduced in book 2, but if you have to close your ears to the other books, then you haven't made a very good argument. A minor nitpick on the first Harry Potter book that does get later explained is not an excuse for you to not explain anything. Hell, as bland as Flip-Flopped was, it still explained stuff. According to the theme song, the people in that world aged backwards. Essentially, the kids were mentally adults, and the adults were mentally kids. Granted, that opens up a bunch of questions about things like reproduction, but at least it explained why the society is the way it is. In your world, the adults seem perfectly rational and able to take care of themselves, and yet they're either too scared or too stupid to realize that.
What people have to realize is that I was never trying to write the Silmarillion.
You are really protesting too much, you know that?
Speaking of that, we expect different things from The Hobbit than we do from Lord of the Rings. That's because The Hobbit is children's fantasy, and Lord of the Rings is adult fantasy.
But which one is more popular and is generally considered the better story? That's right, Lord of the Rings. And speaking of which, even as a standalone book, The Hobbit makes more sense than your world.
And they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and they have their features that you couldn't put in the other. I've always had a hard time taking criticism. Call it ego or anxiety or a bad childhood with way too much criticism or whatever.
And yet you look down on other people who can't take criticism. The hypocrisy is strong with this one.
Yeah, I'm a critic who has a hard time taking criticism. How ironic is that?
As you're so fond of saying, I know it's wrong, but I'm gonna do it anyway.
If I was in an RPG, you could call me a glass cannon. But I will say that I have my reasons for not taking every little bit of criticism that comes my way.
You don't have to, but that doesn't make it right to publicly bitch about it.
First of all, there are people out there who do want me and my projects to fail. I have plenty of trolls who have a very concerned interest in watching me suffer. And I do know that there are plenty of people who would intentionally try to give me counterintuitive or broken information to make my project worse on purpose.
Have you ever thought about just why that is? Maybe it has to do with the rules on your DeviantArt page, or the time you bitched at a guy for going to college, or the time that you blocked everybody who dared to say that trolls and cyberbullies weren't the same thing, or the time that you used an entire review to bitch about getting requests, or the time you used your Asperger's as an excuse to not take criticism from anyone you don't personally know. Yes, some people are jerks, but quite a few of your antis, myself included, used to be fans before they got turned off by your behavior.
This is combined with a tendency on the internet to believe that disagreeing with a critic means that you can't take criticism, and that makes this a no-win situation.
Disagreeing with a critic is one thing. Publicly whining about getting criticism like you're doing is a whole other thing. And you know what? Even someone who's trying to bring you down can still have good points. In fact, this happened to me not long ago with one of my fanfictions. Someone posted multiple reviews about how awful the story was and how I should be ashamed for writing it, but in the midst of all the flaming, there was some good advice. He said the story was getting repetitive, and you know what? It was in danger of getting repetitive. So I kept that in mind and worked on making the story less repetitive. I didn't complain about it or get into a fight with him, I just picked out the good advice and used it. And the advice coming from someone who was being rude didn't make it any less of a good point.
This is why I tend to only really ask for criticism from people that I trust personally. People who won't lead me astray.
And you could have done that without posting the story on the internet and exposing yourself to criticism from all sorts of people. Once you've posted something on the internet, you've exposed it to the public.
People who won't tell me to put in something that makes the book worse. Or people who won't blindly let me do whatever the hell I want and George Lucas the whole thing.
You know, insulting George Lucas doesn't make your project any better. And given how much you whined in this video, I have a hard time believing that you listen to these, quote, people you trust.
And another thing, I'm going to sound amazingly egotistical when I say this, but giving criticism is harder than it looks.
So those meanies who give you criticism just plain don't know how to give criticism.
I've been doing reviews myself for years, and I still make mistakes and fall into traps all of the time. And I used to do it a lot more in the past. If I ever redo my Stuck in the Ringer review, I'll go into full depth with that.
Your Stuck in the Ringer review has little to do with anything here.
Sometimes a critic will place what they want in a work, rather than what might objectively be better. For example, if a critic really likes action, they might critique a more subdued work for being boring and, not having enough action in it.
How many excuses are you going to make here? It's starting to sound really pathetic.
This can be caused sometimes by an uncanny valley effect, where the person actually put too much action into their work, and it started to make people, like the critic, think that it was an action series when it just wasn't. The answer to solving that? It sounds really counterintuitive, but you have to do exactly the opposite of what that critic says, and remove the action that you have, in order to make your work even more subdued and quote-unquote boring.
What? What the hell are you saying? If you get critiqued for not having enough action in your story, you must reduce the action in it? Where's your source for that? What makes you think that's gonna work all the time? I mean, every story is different. You can't just make a generalization like that.
Sometimes, especially on the internet, people aren't very clear, and they don't communicate their feelings very well.
Okay, we get it. You can't take criticism, okay? Stop making all these excuses.
Even if they try, saying that a joke wasn't funny can mean 1,000 different things. From who the characters were, to how the joke was delivered, to the music that played afterwards, to the line delivery. Some people have a hard time striking at their own feelings and figuring out exactly what they don't like about your product.
So anytime you refuse to take criticism, it must be the critic's fault, not yours. Is that what you're saying?
On top of that, you never really know anyone's expertise with the respective genre.
You know, if the makers of, say, Teen Titans Go said half the stuff you're saying here, you'd probably be bashing them to high heaven.
When someone gives a criticism of Growing Around, I don't know how much children's fantasy that they watch or read, or the last time they read something new within the genre. For all I know, they could hate the genre and the conventions that make it what it is.
You know that argument could also apply to the people who praise your work, don't you? Maybe the people who like Growing Around don't know anything about children's fantasy. Or hell, since you block people left and right, maybe they're lying because they don't want to be blocked.
I have a habit of believing that people on the internet don't find children's fantasy their favorite genre of all time.
So now someone must have children's fantasy be their all-time favorite genre in order to be worthy of critiquing your work?
It should go without saying that knowing the conventions of a certain medium or genre is important to giving useful and reliable criticism, which
even someone who doesn't read a lot of children's fantasy can still be able to give good criticism about storytelling or character development or, logic.
Which is one of the reasons that I was so terrible back at the beginning. This is why I usually only take criticism from people I know and trust.
You said that already.
It's because I thoroughly know their experiences and their abilities, and I can trust them not to intentionally send me the wrong way, or give me praise that's unwarranted.
You are really sounding paranoid, you know that?
I need to know both their intentions and their abilities. The truth of the matter is that the book does need criticism, and a lot of it. But like bad or incorrect medicine can kill a patient, bad or incorrect criticism can kill the book.
If you're this paranoid about getting, quote, bad criticism, why did you post it on the internet? And seeing as how you seem to consider wanting some logic in your world to be bad criticism, I really again have to wonder about these people you, quote, trust.
Let me give you an example of how this plays out. One thing a lot of people criticize, demanding to know how the world works, or saying that it can't possibly work or they have too many questions about it.
Oh no, how dare they want some logic?
Here's what I'm doing to fix it. I'm changing the book from third person to Sally's first person. That sounds like a very bizarre decision, and on some level it is. I needed to be amazingly creative to figure this out. Here's the logic behind it. Sally has lived her whole life in the world of growing around, so there's plenty of questions she just wouldn't ask.
But the readers would still ask them.
To her, the grass is green, the sky is blue, and parents do what their kids say.
Kinda like how in the old days, the sky was blue, the grass was green, and women were property of their husbands. You can't just hand-wave away the adult slavery like that.
She's not the one to ask questions about it, since she's not the philosophical type. Just like you would not start a journal entry explaining why you're here on Earth, or that your mom and dad gave birth to you, she wouldn't start a first-person story explaining everything about her world, especially the mundane details.
In other words, you think you found an excuse to not explain stuff. Yet again, she might not ask questions, but your readers definitely will.
How our world works on that level might not even be something that she knows or cares about, beyond silly assumptions.
But again, the readers will. Do you really think making the book first person is going to magically make your readers stop asking questions?
And more importantly, when you get down to it, the book is about her and her interactions with the world, not just the world itself. A fantasy story is about the characters, not about the world.
But the world should also be developed enough to be believable.
And the story is about Sally Dunn trying to become the mayor of her town. Why is it told in the world of growing around? Well, because I can't exactly have a story about a child becoming the mayor of a town in the real world. Unless, I was doing like a full-fledged comedy. And the world paints the plot, like it should in any fantasy story. Even if I was doing this in the real world and changed it to Sally trying to become class president to embarrass the popular girl, it would be a vastly different story, and it would lose what makes it what it is.
Actually, it would probably be a better story because it wouldn't involve adults becoming slaves.
Deep inside, Growing Around is a coming-of-age story.
In a world where coming of age means you lose your freedom. Anyway, now he finally starts talking about the actual story and characters, which I'm going to skip because I don't really want to repeat myself too much. By the way, only about 4 minutes out of a 16-minute video are spent actually talking about the story and characters. The rest of it is spent bitching about criticism or coming up with excuses. Anyway, before we go, I have one last little thing to show you.
Right now, the novel needs a lot of work. And like I said, I'm getting people that I know and trust to help me work on it. When it's as polished as it could possibly be, I'll self-publish it with one of the artists making all of the art for it, and the voice actors and I will do an audiobook. From there, who knows what happens. If you'd like to read what I currently have, the first draft is available through the link below. Keeping in mind with what I said here, tell me what you think. I'd love to hear it.
So after all that bitching about criticism, now he wants to know what you think. Let me guess, he only wants to know what you think if you've got positive things to say. Otherwise, he'll just dismiss you as giving bad criticism. Well, damn, this got long. I'm gonna wrap things up. See you next time. My next video probably won't be a commentary, though.